Perfect. Thank you so much, Christian. I'm very excited to talk about this project, which is going to study index provider, and is a joint work with Yu Han and Yang Son. So let me jump straight into the industry, which we're going to look at, which is the ETF industry in the United States. And this market has grown massively in the last 10, 15 years, going from about 100 billion in 2002 to more than 5 trillion by 2020. And I'm pretty sure that many of you are contributing and are a little bit of a part of this big bar here at the end. So within this big growth, we are interested in studying the role of a specific player that we think have not been analyzed as much in the literature, namely index provider. And just to follow the definition by the S&P Dow Jones, the largest index provider in the world, index providers are basically specialized firms that create and calculate market indexes and then license their intellectual capital as the base for passive products. So this large ETF that I showed you in the previous slides. So just to really be super clear on the structure of the product here, let me show the role of index provider in the ETF industry. We are going to have index provider that, as I just mentioned, provide an index to an ETF sponsor. The ETF sponsor is the one that, if you want, package the product and sell it to the final investor. As a reward, let me now move to the cash flow. The final investor pays management fee to the ETF sponsor, but some of this management fee, the ETF sponsor sort of pass it on to the index provider, and these are called licensing fees. Again, most of you here are familiar, but big name in the ETF sponsor side are Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. Whereas on the index provider side, we have the S&P Dow Jones, MSCI, and Russell. Again, this is sort of the general one. Let me now move to a specific example to give even a better feeling of the role of index provider. So I'm now going to present the largest ETF in the world, SPDR S&P 500 Trust. In this case, the index provider is, not surprisingly, the S&P Dow Jones, and the ETF sponsor is State Street. The investor, when investing in this ETF, pays 9 basis points of the asset under management to State Street. And this management fee have been already studied quite a lot in the literature. What we sort of bring to the table and our focus is more on these 3 basis points of AUM plus $600,000 that State Street pays as licensing fee to the S&P Dow Jones. And just to give you an idea, sort of a flavor of the magnitude, in 2020, given the asset under management, the licensing fee just for this ETF, SPY, were over 100 million of US dollars. So, quite a lot of money in the table. Why we think it's important to study index provider? Well, at least looking at, industry opinion and report, they seem to be more and more important. So, for example, Joel Dixon of Global Head of Vanguard complains that a larger and larger percentage of the expense ratio is now eaten by, so index providers are taking a large sort of slice of the pie through licensing fees. At the same time, Yves Perrier is complaining that index fee are a real problem. And the key reason, and that's why also we got interested in this project, is that it's an oligopoly, basically, of a bunch of index providers that charge a high price, perhaps for adding relatively little value. And so, again, I'm going to go more into, of course, the model and our data, but just really to look at more aggregate stuff, you see that BlackRock have been doing pretty well in the last 7 years or so. If you look at the stock market, the growth of BlackRock, more than 100%. But let's just pick an index provider like MSCI, and you see, well, they experience more than a 600% growth in value. So perhaps, this rent that they capture also are reflected in market prices. So our goal is basically to fill a little bit sort of a gap that we think exists in the literature in understanding the role of index provider, and in particularly the industrial organization of the market, how index provider compete with ETF sponsor, and what is the impact on ultimate investor. And we're going to do in 2 ways. I hope to have time to talk about both. First, through reduced form evidence. In particular, we're going to show 3 facts. Some of them are, I think, more new. Some of them are already quite known. First, that the market is really concentrated. So just a bunch of index providers dominate the market. Second, that these index providers seem to have a lot of brand value, and we're really going to try to isolate brand value from other determinants like returns and fees. And finally, through some new data that we manually collected, we're going to show that the index licensing fee on average in the industry are about 1/3 of the management fees. With this sort of fact in mind, we're going to move to a structural model that is going to allow us to decompose markup and cost. And we're going to show that about 60% of licensing fee are actually markup that are charged by the index provider. They don't seem to justify by cost. And then we're going to run a counterfactual, which we think is really, really policy relevant, which is what if you can regulate this index provider and fully eliminate the market power? A bit of an extreme one, but it's interesting as a benchmark. And we find that this will reduce management fee by almost 1/3 of their current equilibrium value. So let me skip the literature in a short talk. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the data and the fact, show you the model without equation because it's a very short talk, and then hopefully I have time to do some of the estimation and the counterfactual. So some sources are fairly standard. So we're going to take about 600 US equity ETF from Morningstar, and we have basically a 10-year panel from 2010 to these days. We're going to merge this data with CRISP to have information on key variable like return, expense ratio, and of course, asset under management. And there is a third data set, which is sort of the more new one that we bring to the table, which is basically, for not all of them, I'm going to be honest, they're not forced to disclose this information. So we had to go manually in the SEC EDGAR database, look at the contract, and try to infer, at least for some ETF, what is the agreement between the index provider and the ETF sponsor. So we think it's a step in a good direction, but there is more to be done in this sense. So as I preview, I'm going to focus on 3 facts. We have a little bit more, of course, in the paper. A few providers dominate the market. These providers have brand value, and they capture some of the rent that are created, about 1/3 through licensing fee. So just to give you really a bird's eye view idea of the industry, let's look at index provider. S&P Dow Jones, which is the largest, alone in 2019 has more than 50% of the market. And when we look at the top 5 index provider, we see that basically we reach 95% of the cumulative market share based on asset under management. Of course, also the ETF sponsors are quite concentrated. The largest one is iShare, which has about 1/3 of the market by itself. So not as much as S&P Dow Jones, but also a very big player. And again, if we take again the top 5 ETF sponsor, we reach about 95%. Just to give you a summary measure, which is the HHI index. For index provider, this is about 3,300, which is well above the 2,500, which is sort of the threshold that the Department of Justice in the US consider a highly concentrated industry. So the industry is highly concentrated. Let me now dig into the role of index provider. So again, a senior market participant mentioned that really brand is important. It's a bit like with water. It's not that Evian, I mean, we can debate also, as we did on coffee, also water, but it's not that Evian is perhaps so much better than other type of water, but really people value the brand itself. So we try to, of course, test this claim with the data, not just resort to quote. And here is what we do. So the first is a specification where the dependent variable is asset under management. And what we find is that if we simply have index provider fixed effect, the R square is about 24%. So index provider alone explains quite a bunch of the variation. Of course, you can start saying, yeah, but it's about fees, it's about return. These are other determinants that really matter. What we do is we control for fee. Hopefully, demand is downward sloping, so fees are negative, return are positive. We control for ETF category and time. But what we find is that once we add the index provider, we get a marginal R square of about 7%. So even controlling for a lot of determinant of demand, index provider seem to matter for asset under management. We then look at management fee, and we find again that index provider play a huge role. Index provider fixed effect alone is play 64% of the variation. And again, after controlling for a bunch of stuff, the marginal R square is still about 8%. So index provider explain cross-sectional variation in management fee. You may be thinking, well, because of course return are different, but what we find is that when we look at return, index provider alone only explain about 1% of the variation. Thank you. And if we control for other determinants, especially time, which is the main explanatory variable for return, the marginal R square is basically 0. So index provider matter for asset under management, for management fee, not so much for return. Last fact before I go into the model. This is based on the new data that we bring to the table. What we find is basically that the licensing fee are about a third of the management fee that ETF carry. And if we look at our favorite measure that is based on asset under management, they have gone up over time. So from 31% to almost 36%. As I show you at the beginning, these contracts are usually a percentage of EUM plus a fixed fee. And what we find is that the vast majority, almost 100%, anyway, more than 95, is the per AUM component. So as AUM have gone up, the incidence of this licensing fee has gone up as well. Okay, so with this fact in mind, let me really briefly describe the model. Why do we think we need a model? Well, we observe management fee, but we don't know the decomposition between cost and markup. And we're also interested in quantitatively assessing what will be the equilibrium effect of sort of regulating the industry and increasing competition. So short talk, I'm not going to show you not even one equation. Let me give you a flavor of the model. What there is basically a continuum of households that are choosing among a discrete number of different ETFs. So ETFs are just a heterogeneous product, and they are given by a combination of an index provider and an ETF sponsor. In terms of timing, first, index providers set their licensing fee to maximize their own profit. Then each ETF, which is set up by a sponsor, is basically choosing among index provider to match with, and then they are setting management fee. Finally, the final investor, the household, choose from a menu of ETF, taking prices as given, how much to invest their dollar, basically their money. This is really the model. Again, way more there is in the paper. Let me mention how we take the model to the data and our sort of key counterfactual result. So we're going to use a panel of 20 ETF for the US, the largest 20 as of 2019. And we put all the other ETF into a representative outside option. But again, the results are fairly stable if we increase the number of ETF. It takes some time to take the model into the data. Let me try to guide you through the idea. So the demand side is very standard. We're going to have an instrumental variable estimation of a logic demand system using some IV as a supply side shifter to identify demand. And these give us investor preferences, so the investor demand parameters. The first step, together with management fees and market share, which are observable, is going to give us the marginal cost of the ETF that we obtain by inverting their first order condition, so for profit maximizing. Then once we have backed out the unobservable marginal cost, we can project them on the index provider, and this is going to give us the impact of index provider on the cost of the ETF. And then finally, we need a fourth step, which is sort of also a bit of our innovation. We do a maximum likelihood estimation of observing a pair of index provider and ETF sponsor to estimate the substitutability between them, and also back out the marginal cost, this is a very last step, of the index provider. So I'm sorry, I could just give a flavor. Again, if you're interested, I'm happy to talk more or refer you to the relevant part in the paper. Let me show you now the final number in the last 5 minutes or so I have. So in terms of investor demand parameter, again, here the dependent variable is basically the market share. And we find that reassuringly, demand is downward sloping. So higher management fee are associated to lower market share. And again, as we instrument the management fee with our instrument, we find a strong first stage. So the F-stat is about 28. And we find that the elasticity increases. So from minus 0.19 to minus 0.26. And also fairly interesting, we don't see a big role for past return. So, you know, when we focus on the top 20, there is not much variation in return. They are all similar to each other. What really seems to matter is management fees. with the investor demand parameter, as I mentioned, we back out the marginal cost of ETF, and which are unobservable, and that's sort of here the use of the model. And we can then project the marginal cost on fixed effect for the index provider. So the index provider fixed effect are going to give us the relative impact of different licensing fee on the cost for the ETF sponsor. Once we have that, we can sort of close the model and estimate our one of our key structural parameter, which is the substitutability across index provider. And what we find is that this number of 0.53, of course, is a structural parameter, but let me give you an intuition for this number, which is, suppose that index provider A gives 1% higher profit than B for an ETF sponsor, the probability that the sponsor choose A is only 0.53% higher. So basically, demand for index provider is very inelastic, which suggests that the relation between sponsor and provider is very sticky and the market is not very competitive. What we find is indeed is that index provider charge on average licensing fee of 4.4 basis point, of which almost 3 basis point is just pure markup. So the Lerner index for index provider is more than 60%. And again, some industry report markup around 70%. So we think that, at least in the ballpark sense, this number is not unreasonable. And you see that ETF also have quite high markup, but much lower, around 40% than index provider. So index provider, indeed, according to our model, eat a big chunk of the pie. And then we are ultimately interested in the counterfactual question, which is, what if you start regulating them and increase competition? And now with the model, we can do that, basically setting the substitutability parameter to infinity. This means that each ETF will choose the index provider that gives the highest profit. As a result, licensing fee dropped to 1.6 basis point, which is equal basically to the marginal cost of the index provider. Index providers are now in perfect competition, so of course they have no markup, zero profit. And what happened as a result is that ETF sponsor decreased management fee from 9.3 basis point to 6.5. So as a result of increasing competition upstream at the index provider level, there is a decline in management fee by almost 30%, which is good for the ultimate investor. Of course, as a result of the lower marginal cost, ETF sponsor markup increases and goes from 42% to about 60%. So now, the pie, the appropriation of the pie goes from the index provider to the ETF sponsor, but ultimate investor gain because of the lower equilibrium management fee. Okay, so I think right on time, let me conclude that we provide with what we think is one of the first analysis of the competition structure between index provider and ETF sponsor. And combining reduced form evidence and structural analysis, we show that index provider have very strong market power, charge large markup to ETF, which are then passed on to investor with higher management fee. The Lerner index is about 60%, which again is in line with sort of some industry report. And we show in a counterfactual that eliminating this market power will decrease management fee by about 30%. And again, we don't have yet more policy analysis, but we think that there are important policy implications. First of all, in terms of disclosure. We had to go and manually look for this licensing fee. It would be very nice if this type of data are disclosed and we can use them to estimate perhaps even a richer model. And second, in terms of competition policy, I think a lot of emphasis has been on promoting competition downstream, at the ETF sponsor level. What we sort of put in the table is that it's important to think about the two-tier competition and promote competition also upstream. So thanks a lot, and I really look forward to Enrique discussion.
Thank you very much, Matteo. That was a masterpiece in terms of time management. And as you already said, we're very happy to have Enrique Schroth with us, who is going to discuss this paper. Enrique, the floor is yours, 15 minutes.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much for having me at this conference. This is the first time I join, and I'm very happy to do it. I'm also very happy because I had a great paper to discuss, very important topic, and lots to say. Much was said in the paper. my discussion, I think, would be about how to follow within the same paper, but how to. I think we can go a bit deeper, or at least we need to, and that's what I'll say. Can you see my slides now? Yeah. Okay. Very good. All right. So this paper is about competition to deliver us retail finance. We are all retail finance consumers, I suppose. We might think of us as more sophisticated, but truly we are exactly the guys that Matteo was describing initially. We buy into this stuff. Okay. Could it be delivered more cheaply to us? That's essentially one takeaway that stands out from the paper. And what is it that they're really doing? The paper says quite a bit about that. I mean, indexers are supposedly providing the service of making an index. I mean, are they really? Let's discuss, right? And ETFs pay them in order to deliver this index to us retail investors. That means that there could be a double markup in the process. Is there one? How high it is? This paper is going to answer that with estimates of the marginal cost of first indexing and then delivering, right? And at the same time, the demand that ETFs have for an index provider, and the demand that we retail investors have for these ETF products. Okay, the main takeaway is that there is market power in both instances. Okay, the ETFs have some market power over us retail consumers, and the index providers have some over them. And this is especially the strongest bit. Okay, and that's where the costs, the ultimate cost to us retail consumers will come from mostly. As a synopsis, in the paper, there is a very useful description of the data. I enjoy that part a lot. I learned much from it, and I recommend you read that bit on its own. You'll learn a lot. You'll see some interesting statistics about market shares, about concentration, about the fees that we pay, and the fees from some of the licensing agreements that they've manually looked at. Okay, there's a model of oligopoly pricing in two stages. First, in the index provision, and then extending that into the licensing agreement, and finally, there's also oligopoly in the delivery to the retail consumers. There is an elastic demand also in both stages, and that's the source for profits in equilibrium. These are the structural parameters that the estimation is after. And then there is a counterfactual analysis at the very end, which is I mean, it is a simple exercise, but it's very useful because it's a big picture. It's sort of a measure of how much gains could be created without telling us how. It is a benchmark, as Matteo said, of how much are we talking about here that could be saved? Okay, so in particular, licensing fees could drop up to 60%, which would then translate into a drop of 30% in the management fees that we pay. We could probably treat this as an upper bound. That's the right way to do it. It doesn't mean that this is what we should get with some simple policy, but not at all. Okay. All right. So what can I say about this paper before I get into details? I think it's a very engaging paper. It's obviously an extremely important topic. Retail finance, we don't talk enough about it in our profession, and I was happy to see a paper about that. On the other hand, the paper is young. I think I don't know. I mean, I'm making some inference here, but it reads like a paper that has had a first take at the data, a good take, but we need to go further. And I think some of this extra analysis or going deeper is technical. Okay, so I suppose some of these issues can be solved with discussion or not so difficult to address. So I'll start with those, get the technical aspects out of the way. It basically involves enriching a little bit the estimation methods, But then I think most importantly, the paper needs to go deeper into the causes of this low competition. Okay, what is it really that these index providers are doing to make this market uncontestable? And it has remained uncontestable for a long time, and this despite the very, very large growth in demand for index investment. Okay, so that's really, you know, I learned a lot from the paper, but I've remained puzzled to a bit or with big questions, which maybe this paper could start addressing. I don't think it can answer everything that we need to know yet, but we could move in that direction. So about the technical aspects, okay, very quickly. Let me start with the quicker ones. There is there's some assumptions about the structural errors that I would like at least some discussion. For example, this assumption that the structural error on the investor's demand is IID with type 1 extreme value distribution, but the structural error in the demand by ETFs for an index provider is type 2 extreme value and IID. Now, I understand these are not unstandard assumptions in this literature to get closed form demands, okay? But what do they mean economically? Maybe you could help us a little bit to understand, because they will determine the functional form of the demand curves that we use and the loading into these structural parameters, which are crucial, right? These elasticities. So I think that can be dealt with discussion, but I think more importantly is this assumption that the ETF structural error is IID, especially since one interpretation that you give in the paper is that it's due to persistence or in the relation or synergies in the relation between the ETF and the index provider, which surely aren't IID. So that was a bit dissonant for me, the assumption made to get a closed form. And also, you know, maybe this can be specified in the whole, because persistence is observable to some extent. So maybe a reduced form formulation of that error as a function of observed persistence might help here. Second is, you know, there are macro foundations for these demand models, right? The Lancaster approach to differentiated products. If I'm consuming Perrier versus Evian water, that's exactly what I want. And it might be suitable for these type of ETFs. I'm not saying it isn't. One consequence of this approach, of course, is that there is substitutability between some attributes that we value from this bottle of water or this car or this ETF and the price that we pay. Okay, so that's fine. The only thing is that, of course, when we're talking about assets, not goods that we consume, the price is important, but also the returns are a clear benefit. I understand that there's branding, and that's also taken into account. I understand also that the returns are pretty much homogeneous, okay, cross-sectionally. But there may be differences in volatilities, okay, over time certainly, and maybe even cross-sectional. So maybe the right thing to specify here, to estimate this parameter, which, right, it gives us basically our relative indirect valuation for returns, for net returns versus attributes. Maybe the right way to do it is to specify it as the Sharpe ratio. Okay, I think that might. I don't think it will change things dramatically, but it would change this estimate of alpha a bit, especially with so much growth. Certainly, the risk tolerance of marginal investor has changed a lot in this data set, and I wonder to what extent that impacts the inference we make about alpha. Okay, okay, those two I think not too hard to deal with. I'm a bit more worried about this third one, which is obviously, you know, if you want to estimate that demand function, you cannot do it by OLS because the fees are probably a function of the unobservable attributes, so they're not uncorrelated. You use a not unreasonable approach, which is standardish, which is to use the fees that other ETFs are charging, okay, as an instrument. And that, I've seen this used before. The problem here, of course, is that if we're talking about an industry equilibrium, then the first order conditions by any fund have this form where you add a markup over the marginal cost. And this markup is a function of the market shares, but that means it's an equilibrium is a function of all the fees, right? So got it. So I'm not sure it really satisfies this orthogonality constraint. Of course, you say if we include an index of the fees of those competitors that are not directly observably competing against our funds, that could help. I agree, but then that comes at a trade-off, which is that the relevance condition is probably compromised. Okay, and in the end, even if it's indirectly competitive, they're still in competition. There could be a way to address that, which is to make the substitution with indirect competitors depend on another parameter, right? It could be further distance. So this one worries me a bit. The assumptions they might not hold, but maybe you want to enrich in what you mean by direct competition and indirect competition. There might be a parameter to summarize. Now, what I would like more thinking about, more structure, is this problem with the undisclosed fees. Okay, so if I got it correctly, you looked up for as many fees or licensing agreements as you could identify, and that covers 10% of the licensing agreements in the data. What do we do with the other 90? Which direction would be the bias, if there were any selection bias? And how do we estimate the demand for an index provider with so many missing observations? Of course, the paper does have a clever solution, which is to say, well, if I know the fees and I estimate the markup from the demand estimation, then that has to be the marginal cost. And then the component of that marginal cost that is explained by index fixed effects could be my estimate of the licenses fee using the control function approach. This is the plug into the demand. Okay. Now, first out of the bat, fine, that's okay. But then the standard errors probably need some fixing. So I wasn't sure how you did that. But more importantly, is this the right data generating process for the unobserved licensing fees? In other words, why are they not reporting is an important and a useful question. It could be well related, I think, to what the true data generating process is. Why are these, and one thing we see is that there's sort of exposed exclusivity, right? So we have almost a one provider per ETF. Is this part of an equilibrium where you are pricing your equilibrium deliverer ETF of the indexing in a way that you price out all the others? Is this a barrier to entry effectively to this market, and why it remains so expensive to retail investors? Okay, I am running out of time, this is generally what I think the paper needs, a bit more digging into why this market is not competitive. My colleague down the corridor, Lionel Martellini, would say, well, it's because indexing is complex. But I think I only buy the argument for thematic ETFs, not for the, as you call, report market in the paper. So I'm still in search for a big picture explanation of what's going on. Some could be achieved by describing in more detail the actual loadings of your attributes, okay? And maybe some attributes could be included in the specification to understand deeper what's behind this branding effect, okay? Explaining parameter sensitivity. Here's an exercise that might work, or at least help. What if, for example, the licensing fees that you impute, this plug, for 90% of the data, instead of coming from this first order condition, which essentially assumes that the index providers are taking as given the ETF demand, right? What if it were truly drawn with a bias, upward or downward bias, meaning that there is a special treatment for those that eventually choose you. There's a bilateral negotiation, a licensing fee that blocks all others for entry. Okay, so simulate your data with an upward bias of a fixed size or downward bias, and how that changes your estimate of sigma. Okay, I would like to see an exercise like that to understand if you know what might be the true data generating process of the licensing fee. Okay, I have other comments, but I think a summary of my suggestion is really to think how ETFs and licensed index providers get matched. Okay, is the licensing fee chosen to maximize the index provider's fee, taken as given the demand for its index by all ETFs, or is it an entry deterrent strategy? Okay, that signs an exclusivity deal with one ETF and precludes other ETFs from providing the same index. That means you will have to estimate it differently, right? So probably jointly. There are examples of papers who you can estimate with imputation at the same time. I guess Kayako Yasuda's job market paper is one. Yeah, I think that could help a lot, especially with improving the counterfactual analysis, right? And I'll finish with this, which is how will fee disclosure improve the competitiveness of this market? I think that's important, because fee disclosure will basically tell us whether the deal offered in equilibrium to the unique deliverer, the unique ETF, is lower than what it's actually asking every other ETF that wants to provide the same index. Yeah, that's it. Quick comment on the title. I didn't understand why it was whales. I mean, whale is a big animal. It's a passive, rather slow animal. So I thought maybe what you mean is sharks or fat cats. I don't know. It really confused me. But anyway, thanks. So I enjoyed it.